Through all the different forms of state, whether it's Russia or the Soviet Union, that region has always been synonymous with chess. Today, 9 Russian players have held the title of world champion. They by far have the highest number of Grandmasters and are undoubtedly the strongest chess country in existence. But all this success has not come without controversy. From multiple cheating scandals involving Russian players to political problems, Russia has been under the limelight for as long as they have been at the top of the chess world. And ultimately, it might be the reason for their self-implosion. Currently, Russia has not held the world title since 2007, and they seem to have lost their dominance in chess. Their players are in disagreement and they can't even represent their own country in the current political state that they are in. So how did all this happen? Well, the first big Russian chess player was Alexander Alakin. He rose through the ranks of chess in the early 1900s before Russia was established in the scene, becoming a world-class grandmaster in 1914 and a source of pride for Russia, and then it all turned dark. When World War I broke out, he was playing at a tournament in Germany. Him and 10 other Russian players were held captive for the war. After being released, he would be charged with counterintelligence by the Russian government. Later, he'd marry a Swiss journalist, and when asked for permission to visit the West to see her again, he would go and never return. He did not agree with the government regime, and the Soviet Chess Federation released a memorandum stating that he should be regarded as an enemy of the Soviets. All contact was broken, and even his brother Alexei, whom he was very close with publicly, refused to be associated with him. He would later find citizenship in France for his studies, but the damage was already done. Russia's best player had been lost, and they needed to establish some new stars. The chess culture in Russia began from one man, Vladimir Lenin. Although chess had been for the upper classes before the Russian Revolution, Lenin loved playing chess and used his influence to spread it. The government began backing and funding chess education. Chess education was heavily promoted to the Russian youth, and tournaments were being ramped up in order to increase the skill of the field. And in 1924, world-renowned player was invited to the Soviet Chess Championship to gauge the progress of the players versus the world. And of course, he smoked the field, and the Soviets studied it all. The way he prepared, the way he played, his technique, everything. They were determined to create the next world-class player, and it only took a couple of years for the gap to be closed, as the very next year would win the Soviet championship again, but in a much less dominant fashion. He and the other top players started to drop games against the Soviet players. Chess was considered so important as it was a great matter of international pride. So much so that even through shortages, the Soviets would still make sure to get paper to make magazines and educate the youth about chess. This is the creation of the so-called Soviet School of Chess, a combination of pride, hard work, determination, and resources to ascend to the top of the chess world. There was a huge emphasis on rigorous training and the study of the game, which allowed the Soviets to create some of the best chess players to ever play the game. Mikhail Botvinnik was the first product of these schools to reach the world stage. The Soviets at the time used chess as a symbol of communism's superiority, so Botvinnik's actions were crucial. According to David Bronstein, Boris Verlinsky had won the 1929 Soviet Championship, but it was given to Botvinnik as it seemed much more politically correct to them. In a sense, Russia did not only see pride in being the best at chess, but also political advantages that came with it too. Fast forward to the Cold War, and the Soviet Union is dominating chess. All the best players were Soviet. They had the chess scene in a chokehold. In 1945, the US top 10 Grandmasters played an over-the-radio match versus the Soviet Union's top 10 Grandmasters. The American team had won 4 straight chess Olympiads, but the Soviets had never played in any of those tournaments. And the Soviets dominated, winning by a score of 15.5 to 4.5, and the domination would not stop there. From 1948 to 1969, every single chess championship match was disputed by 2 Soviet players, until a new opponent stepped on the scene. His name was Bobby Fischer, and he was American. He was the only player able to compete with the Soviets, despite the advanced development and full teams dedicated to chess that the Soviets had. Fischer was a menace to the Soviet dynasty, but to better understand, we need to go back in time. In 1962, a young and up-and-coming Fischer accused 3 of the Soviet players of colluding to pre-arrange fast draws in order to conserve their energy for their individual matches against Fischer. He accused the candidates' tournament of being rigged in favor of the Soviets and vowed to never play in one again. After this, FIDE would reform the candidates to be a knockout tournament, which would better fit the circumstances. In the next candidates match, Fischer would destroy the whole competition and make it through all the way to the championship match to face the Soviet Boris Spassky. Fischer lost the first 2 and started complaining about the presence of cameras. The match was moved to a back room in which Fischer won 7 of 19, losing only 1 and drawing 11 to become the world chess champion. This game of chess was, however, much bigger than just chess. This was in the middle of the Cold War. Among many elite Soviet players, Fischer was the only one who could compete, and he was American. This dynamic put many eyes onto the game, as it made the front of newspapers and was reported on everywhere. Fischer ultimately gave up the title without defending it due to a lack of agreement, and the Soviet Union would go back to dominating till the 90s, when the Soviet Union dissolved, and the Soviet Union was no more. Russia still had strong players, but had effectively lost many players to countries declaring their independence, and wasn't as powerful. Their dominance would remain until the early 2000s, when the rest of the world began to catch up. The Soviet school advanced teaching techniques weren't exclusive, and the elite chess players began to diversify in terms of origin countries. Additionally, not as much money was being pumped into chess as it was during the Soviet times. Kasparov and Karpov were the last from these schools to dominate, and after their downfalls, Russian chess would struggle to even have a world champion. Russia today still has some of the strongest players, and by far the most grandmasters by an insane margin, but struggles to dominate tournaments. They remain a country with strong chess culture and infrastructure, but the rest of the world has caught up. Regardless, Russia clearly still has a great pride in chess. Current Russian President Vladimir Putin has been a huge supporter of Sergei Karyakin, who has promised to bring back the crown to Russia, as they have not won the world championship since 2007, and they are doing everything in their power to do so. Karyakin has received hundreds of thousands in sponsorships from Russian companies, been invited on many popular talk shows, been put on many billboards in Moscow, received an apartment, a manager, and even received a Mercedes and a driver for it, in support of his world championship aspirations. And today, Russia as a country in general is just one of the most controversial. It always seems to be producing countless news stories and disputes all the time, and their chess scene is in the exact same state. Recently, Russia invaded and started a war in Ukraine to the dismay of many people. Sergei Karyakin is not one of those people. He's been known as a supporter of the Putin government and publicly supported the invasion on social media. This led to FIDE banning him from competitive play for 6 months for a violation of ethics policies. This ban meant he would miss a very important candidates tournament. Ironically, his replacement in the candidates ended up being Ding Liren, who went on to win the whole world championship instead of Karyakin. In response to the war, 44 top Russian chess players wrote an open letter to Vladimir Putin, voicing firm opposition to the war in Ukraine. And obviously Karyakin didn't sign this letter. This marks a terrible spot for Russian chess, as Russia is already being sanctioned in every way possible, and their own players are struggling to find support for their own country's politics. Well, this moment also marks a shifting of tides, as a huge part of what made the Soviet Union a powerhouse in chess was their power to make their players conform to their demands and requests. If something was not done as asked, the consequences would be terrible, and the evidence is pretty glaring. Look at this post by Grandmaster Gregory Serper. He grew up as a promising player in the Soviet Union chess schools, and was drafted into the army in the 80s. He was given the task of beating his opponents over the chessboard for the glory of the Soviet Union. He was given the option between playing the easier Army Championship and the World Junior Championship. Serper surprisingly chose the much very harder World Junior Championship instead of the much more favorable and easier game in the Army Championships. His colonel said, "If you win a medal in the World Junior Championship, then as you know, your success is never blamed. But if you finish the tournament below 3rd place, then the rest of your army service will take place on the little island," basically threatening to send him to the middle of nowhere if he didn't make the Soviet Union proud. And he'd end up finishing 3rd and saving himself. These players had no choice. They had to make their country proud or there would be very, very bad consequences. To expand on his other post, he made another one, this time talking about different examples of this happening. To the Soviet Union, these games were literally life and death. And they hated losing, especially the capitalist countries, and even worse, the United States. So when Taimanov lost his match to the American Bobby Fischer 0-6 in the 1971 candidates quarterfinal, the Soviet Union's chess committee had an urgent meeting and decided to strip Taimanov of all his honorary titles, remove his pay from their sports department, and take away his privilege to travel. Korchnoi found himself in a similar situation in 1974. Him and fellow Soviet Karpov were in the finals of the candidates, waiting to see who would face the defending champion Bobby Fischer. They were both asked who they thought could beat Fischer, to which Karpov didn't have any doubt he could. Meanwhile, Korchnoi said nobody could beat Fischer, and in that minute, their fates were sealed. Karpov was favored in every way. Close friend and strong grandmaster David Bronstein was punished for assisting Korchnoi. Petrosian made a public statement with the Soviet Federation against Korchnoi and the young generation, saying that they weren't good enough to beat Fischer. And of course, through all this, Karpov would win the candidates final over Korchnoi. After this, the USSR wouldn't allow him to leave the country except for occasional tournaments. At one of these tournaments in Amsterdam, he would defect due to all the things that the Soviet Union was doing to him, and leave behind a wife and a child. And this wasn't even rare. There's a whole Wikipedia page dedicated to people who defected, and there's multiple chess players on here. So it wasn't really a secret what the Soviets did, and many people didn't exactly agree with it by defecting. So how does this relate to current Russian chess? Well, just like their country, Russian players seem to be stuck in controversy. Earlier I talked about Karyakin's controversy, but what about Kramnik, their world champion in 2007? The former world champion was infamously accused of cheating in the 2006 World Chess Championship. While playing in the World Championship, his opponent and his team found Kramnik to be having a suspicious amount of bathroom breaks. They claimed that these special cables could be a way of him cheating. In response, FIDE made both players use a common bathroom and closed the previous ones. Kramnik refused to play under these conditions and forfeited Game 5 of the championship. Ultimately, they would revert to the old bathroom arrangements for Game 6, and the game would go on, and to this day, the pair refused to even shake hands. But this was not the end of the stubbornness for Kramnik. Just recently, Kramnik subtly accused Hikaru of cheating through his Chess.com account. Basically, Hikaru was going for the highest Blitz Chess.com rating ever, and played much less skilled players. On his run, he won 45 games, drew 1, and lost none against players of an average ELO of 2950. Kramnik claims that this is statistically improbable and has hired mathematicians to calculate it. Ultimately, it was revealed that the players had much worse over-the-board FIDE ELOs, meaning that they might just have inflated Chess.com ELOs. The internet in general seemed to be taking Hikaru's side in this huge controversy, but let me know what you guys think in the comments about it. In the end, Chess.com ended up muting his account and removing his blog. One of the people who agreed with Kramnik was fellow Russian Yan Nepomniachtchi, who made the tweet that began the whole ordeal, supposedly supporting the claims. He's one of the biggest bright spots for Russian chess. He's finished as runner-up at the last 2 chess championships and is currently ranked 5th in the world. And ironically, as I'm recording this video, 2 Russian players have found themselves in even more controversy. In the 2024 FIDE World Blitz Championship, Daniel Dubov and Yan Nepomniachtchi were facing off in the late game, where they decided to do this. In a FIDE World Championship tournament, they moved around the knights a couple times while laughing and smiling, and then agreed on a draw. This is super ironic to the story of Russian chess because they've always taken it so seriously in the past. And of course, the chess community was in uproar. It blew up on Twitter with many commenting on it. Ultimately, the chief arbiter would forfeit both the players' half points that they received from the matches draw for a prearranged draw based on the move played. The situation that these players go through represents how Russian chess is now and throughout all the times really. Powerful, but controversial. Since the beginnings of the Soviet chess schools, they've always had the strongest chess players, but their political ways, training methods, and nature have managed to never leave them out of controversy. From cheating scandals to defection to collusion, Russia has seen it all, and it seems to produce the most influential yet controversial players.